She knocked, clutching her baby brother like he was the last thing that mattered. He opened the door expecting a beggar, but what he found would rewrite the rest of his days. A girl, broken but brave, asking only not to be sent back. The knock came just after sundown, 3 slow taps that barely rose above the hiss of wind curling around the cabin. The horses didn't stir. The fire inside popped once, then fell quiet again. Jacob Thorne glanced up from his worn chair, fingers stilling over the Bible spread open in his lap. He waited a moment, unsure if he'd imagined it. Then it came again, 3 more knocks, not frantic, not loud, just tired. He rose, joints stiff from a day's work, and crossed the cabin to the door. He hadn't had a visitor in months, not since last winter's thaw when the mail wagon still tried to run this far. Folks didn't come up Jacob's Ridge unless they meant to, and even then most turned back. He unlatched the door and swung it open. There she stood. A little girl no older than 9, eyes too wide for a face so small, hair tangled beneath a sun-faded bonnet. Her coat hung off her like it had belonged to someone much bigger once, perhaps her father, perhaps no one. In her arms, bundled in fraying cloth and barely the size of a feed sack, was a baby. The infant's face was red with cold, his breathing shallow and uneven. The girl blinked up at him, lips trembling from more than just the chill. "Please," she said, voice rough like gravel dragged over wood, "don't send me back to the man who hurt us." Jacob stared, words drying up in his throat. He stepped aside without thinking. "Come in." She didn't hesitate. She shuffled past him, her boots soaked and her legs shaking beneath her. The baby whimpered once, then fell quiet again. Jacob closed the door behind them, sealing out the wind, and turned to see her sinking to her knees by the fire. She sat the baby in her lap, unwrapping the layers gently as though scared to move too fast. Jacob fetched a blanket, one of the thick ones from the foot of his bed, and draped it over her shoulders. He knelt beside her, careful not to crowd her. "What's your name?" "Macy," she whispered. "This is Jonah, he's 3 months." Jacob reached out slowly, his hands rough but steady, and touched the baby's cheek. Cold, too cold, but still pink beneath the skin. "You walked here?" he asked. Macy nodded, not looking at him. "From where?" Her jaw clenched. "South Trail, past Dead Mule Creek." Jacob swore under his breath, not in profanity but in disbelief. That was 20 miles of rough country, some of it nothing but switchbacks and stone. No way a girl and a baby made that without help. "No one came with you." She shook her head, eyes still locked on the fire. "He passed out drunk, so I took Jonah and ran." Jacob sat back, trying to make sense of it. "Who is he?" Macy's lips pressed into a hard line. She didn't answer. Jacob looked around the cabin, the space suddenly too quiet, too warm for a night like this. He stood and went to the stove, ladling hot stew into 2 bowls. He set them on the table, then brought one to the girl. "Eat." She hesitated. Her eyes flicked from the bowl to his face, searching for something. Jacob didn't flinch. "I don't want nothing from you," he said simply. "Just eat, get warm." She took the bowl and began to eat in small, desperate spoonfuls. She fed Jonah next, dipping a rag into the broth and pressing it gently to the baby's lips. Jacob watched them both in silence. He'd seen things before, widows lost on the road, boys running from war, farmers driven off their land, but nothing like this. A child carrying another child across a frozen ridge. When Macy had eaten her fill, she slumped against the hearth, too exhausted to sit up straight. Jonah had fallen asleep, his breath now slow and even. Jacob gathered them both gently, lifting the girl with one arm and the baby with the other. She didn't resist. He laid them in his bed and covered them with every blanket he owned. He took the chair for himself that night. But sleep didn't come. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the pines. Snow began to fall again, thick and slow. Jacob stared into the fire, jaw tight. He hadn't spoken to another soul in almost a year, not since Miriam died. The last thing he expected was a child showing up on his porch begging for mercy. And yet here they were. He rose before dawn, careful not to wake them. He chopped wood, fed the stove, boiled water. When the baby began to cry, Macy stirred, blinking slowly like someone waking from a dream that hadn't ended yet. She sat up quickly, arms wrapping around Jonah like she thought he might vanish. Then she saw Jacob pouring milk into a chipped mug and stopped. "I didn't steal anything," she said quickly. "I swear." Jacob didn't turn, didn't say you did. She watched him for a long moment. "You gonna take us back?" He set the mug on the table, then turned and looked her dead in the eye. "Not unless you want me to." Tears came then, quiet, fast, like rain sneaking past shutters. Macy looked away, biting her lip. She bounced Jonah gently in her arms. Jacob poured oats into a pot. He said nothing more. By mid-morning she was up, moving about the cabin with small, uncertain steps. She cleaned the dishes without being asked, wiped down the table, even tidied the pile of books near the hearth. Jonah slept most of the morning. Jacob said little, but watched everything. That afternoon he stepped out to chop wood and found tracks, small boot prints, leading from the back of the cabin out toward the edge of the ridge. His heart stuttered. He followed them quickly, afraid she tried to run again or worse, but what he found stopped him cold. Macy stood at the edge of the cliff, staring out across the valley. In her arms she held Jonah tight. Her shoulders trembled. Jacob stepped closer. "You planning to jump?" She didn't turn. "I thought about it." The words cut like a blade. He swallowed. "Why?" She turned slowly. Her eyes weren't angry, just tired. "Because he's gonna come looking, and if he finds us," her voice broke, "it's better to disappear than go back." Jacob didn't know what to say, not right away. Finally he spoke. "Then you won't go back, not if I have a say." Macy stared at him. "You don't know him." "I don't need to." That night the wind changed direction. It came from the south, warmer, meaner. Jacob felt it in his bones. Something was coming. He didn't know when or how, but he knew this. A man who drove a child to run with a baby in her arms, he wouldn't give up easy. And Jacob Thorne wasn't the kind of man to let harm knock twice. The next morning came with a strange quiet, the kind that made a man listen harder. No birdsong, no creak of trees in the wind, just a silence that settled over the ridge like a warning. Jacob sat on the porch sharpening his hatchet, boots planted firm against the rough boards. He kept glancing toward the trail that curved down through the pines, waiting. Not for anyone specific, but for what felt inevitable. Behind him he heard movement. Macy stepped out into the morning light, bundled in a coat 2 sizes too big, Jonah tucked close to her chest. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry. She didn't say a word, just sat down on the edge of the porch and pulled her knees up. Jacob didn't look at her. He kept working the blade slowly. "You get any sleep?" She nodded some. "Baby okay?" She looked down. "He's warm, slept through most of the night." Jacob nodded once, then ran the whetstone over the hatchet again. Macy watched him, silent for a long stretch. Then quietly, "I can help. I ain't lazy." Jacob didn't respond right away. He stopped sharpening and tested the blade with his thumb, then stood and walked toward the woodpile. "Come on then." She followed. Together they stacked a full row of split logs beside the door. Macy moved slow, careful not to jar the baby too much. She didn't complain. She didn't stop. Every now and then she paused to adjust Jonah's blanket or whisper to him softly, soothing his little whimpers before they grew into cries. Jacob noticed the way her hands shook, even when her face stayed calm. Once the work was done, he filled a bucket at the creek and they went back inside. He handed her a clean rag and a tin basin. "For the baby," he said. Macy cleaned Jonah gently, humming a soft tune Jacob didn't recognize. The baby stirred, wriggling in her arms, but stayed quiet. He was small, too small for his age, Jacob guessed, but alert now that the chill had gone from his bones. Jacob stirred the pot on the stove and added another pinch of salt. "How long since you ate regular?" Macy shrugged. "Don't know, we mostly got scraps. Sometimes he'd bring bread from the tavern if he remembered. Mostly I just fed Jonah first and hoped there was something left." The words stung more than they should have. Jacob stirred harder. "You ever known your ma and pa?" She looked up. "Mama died birthing Jonah. I remember her singing sometimes, not much more. Pa got sick when I was 6. Fever took him in 2 days." Jacob nodded. Life had a cruel way of forgetting children. "Then who took you in?" Macy's jaw tensed. Name was Otis Yarrow. Said he was a cousin on Mama's side. Showed papers. Folks in town believed him. Preacher too. said it was the Lord's will. Someone stepped up. Jacob frowned, but he hurt you. Macy didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence filled with meaning heavier than words could hold. That afternoon, Jacob took the girl and her baby brother out to the shed. He had a pile of old clothes stored in a cedar trunk, Miriam's things, folded neat but untouched since the funeral. He let Macy pick through them in silence, helping her sort out what might fit. When she found a simple brown dress with patched elbows and held it to her chest, she looked up at him. "Was this your wife's?" He nodded once. "She wore it in the spring, said it breathed better." Macy traced the stitching along the hem, then folded it carefully over her arm. "I'll take care of it," she said softly. Jacob believed her. As the sun dipped low, he brought out an old cradle from the attic. It was dusty and worn, the legs creaky, but still sturdy. He set it near the hearth and lined it with fresh quilts. Macy placed Jonah inside with a tenderness that didn't match her age. Later that night, over a bowl of stew, she asked the question he'd been waiting for. "What happens now?" Jacob didn't look up. "You stay as long as you need. I've got room." "But when he comes?" Jacob met her eyes across the table. "Then we deal with it." Macy nodded slowly. She didn't smile, but something eased in her shoulders. That evening she fell asleep curled beside the cradle, one hand resting on Jonah's belly. Jacob sat in his usual chair, watching the flames dance. The cabin felt different now. Not just fuller, something deeper. Like the presence of life had stirred up old dust and memory and made it all breathe again. But peace was a fragile thing in this land. The next morning, Jacob rode into town. He left Macy with clear instructions. Lock the door behind him, don't answer for no one but him, and keep the rifle nearby. She didn't argue. He took the long trail down the ridge, snow crunching beneath Hooper's hooves. The sky hung gray and low. Wind sliced through the valley like a warning. Town was quieter than usual, even for midwinter. The general store had its shutters half drawn, and the tavern door creaked on rusted hinges. Jacob tied Hooper outside the sheriff's office and stepped in. Sheriff Darrow looked up from a stack of papers, eyes narrowing. "Well, I'll be. Jacob Thorne riding into town like the dead done walked." Jacob grunted, "Need a word." Darrow leaned back in his chair. "You ain't one for words these days." "This one's important." Darrow's eyes sharpened. "Go on." Jacob stepped closer. "Otis Yarrow, what do you know about him?" Darrow scratched his beard. "Drinks hard. Got a claim out past Dead Mule, though I hear it's dry. Comes into town every few weeks smelling like rot and bragging about money he don't got." Jacob folded his arms. "He's got a girl and a baby, says they're kin." Darrow's mouth tightened. "That's what he says." "You believe him?" Darrow looked away. "Not sure what I believe anymore, Jacob. Folks show papers, preacher says a prayer, we figure it's God's will, but truth don't always live in the pages." Jacob leaned in. "You ever seen bruises on that girl?" Darrow didn't answer. That was enough. Jacob turned to leave. "Jacob," the sheriff called after him, "if you're planning something." "I ain't. Just be careful. Men like Yarrow don't stay gone forever, they come looking." "I'm counting on it." Jacob rode back faster than he came. The clouds had thickened, snow starting to fall again. He didn't like being away too long, not with that girl up there alone, not when something in his gut told him Yarrow had already started sniffing. He crested the ridge just as dusk fell and saw the cabin light burning. No smoke on the wind, no hoofprints near the trail. "Good." Macy met him at the door, rifle still clutched tight in her arms. Her face broke in relief when she saw him. "You came back," she said. "Course I did." She stepped aside and let him in. Jonah was asleep in the cradle, the fire warm and strong. Jacob removed his coat and boots, nodding toward the stove. "Stew still warm." Macy smiled faintly. "I added carrots." That night as the storm returned in earnest, they sat in silence watching the flames curl upward. Jacob knew they were only buying time. A man like Yarrow didn't forget, and he didn't forgive. But Jacob Thorne had already lost once. He didn't plan to lose again. The storm didn't ease for 3 days. Wind battered the cabin with fists of ice and snow, howling through the valley like something wild and unchained. The ridge trail disappeared beneath drifts higher than Macy's shoulders, and the pines groaned beneath their frozen weight. But inside the cabin, a different kind of quiet took hold, warmer, slower, tentative. Macy took to rising early, often before Jacob. She de-feed Jonah with careful hands, humming tunes too soft to catch all the words. She tidied the hearth, swept ash from the floor, folded blankets no one asked her to fold. At first Jacob tried to wave her off, told her to rest, said she didn't owe him chores, but she kept doing them anyway. Not out of duty, out of need, to move, to feel useful, to survive in a way that gave her back some control. Jacob didn't push. He knew what it meant to keep busy when the past clawed at your mind. He took to teaching her little things, how to stoke the fire without choking it, how to measure flour for bread, how to hold a knife when chopping carrots, how to mend a rip without puckering the cloth. She learned fast, quick hands, sharp eyes, a stubborn streak that reminded him of Miriam in the spring. Jonah thrived in the warmth. His cheeks filled out. His cries turned into coos. He'd kick his legs with more strength each day, reaching up with clumsy fists to bat at the shadows on the rafters. Macy always watched him with the kind of fear only mothers should carry, the fear of losing what little you still have. By the fourth morning, Jacob knew something was wrong before the sun even rose. He was out by the chicken coop breaking ice from the water trough when he heard the horses snort deep and sharp, not frightened, alert, watching. Jacob straightened, axe in hand, and scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. No wind, no crunch of snow, but something had shifted in the air. The quiet wasn't the same, it was listening. He returned to the cabin slow, eyes sweeping side to side. He knocked snow from his boots at the threshold and stepped inside. Macy looked up from where she knelt, cleaning a milk bottle near the stove. "What is it?" she asked. "Maybe nothing," he said, "but keep the rifle close." She didn't ask questions, just nodded and went to retrieve it from behind the woodpile. Jacob checked the door latch twice that night, sat in his chair facing the window. The storm had passed, but the cold hadn't. The sky outside was moonless, the woods a wall of black. He didn't sleep. At first light, he went out again. Hooper stood restless in the pen, shifting from hoof to hoof, nostrils flaring. The chickens didn't cluck. They just huddled, still as stone. Jacob followed the path to the ridge, eyes sharp for anything out of place. He found it less than a quarter mile down. Tracks. Fresh. 3 sets. One large, deep, boots with worn heels and wide spread, someone heavy, strong. The other 2 smaller, likely horses, maybe a pack animal too. The trail hadn't been there yesterday. That meant someone was nearby, watching, waiting. Jacob returned to the cabin and locked the door behind him. Macy looked up from the cradle, alarm flickering in her eyes. "He's close, ain't he?" she whispered. Jacob didn't lie. Someone is. Macy stood. Her fingers tightened around Jonah like she expected the walls to fall in. "We have to run." Jacob shook his head. "Nowhere to go. Snow's too deep off trail. If we try to leave, we freeze before sunset." "Then what?" Her voice cracked. "You gonna fight him?" "If I have to." Macy trembled. She looked smaller in that moment than ever before, not weak, just worn out by the weight of fear that never left her. Jacob crossed the room and put a steady hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone," he said simply. She nodded, but her breath was shaky. Jacob spent the rest of the day preparing. He reinforced the door with a spare timber, barred the back windows, and pulled the rifle out to clean it. The shotgun stayed over the mantel, fully loaded. Macy stayed close to Jonah, never more than arm's reach from the cradle. Every now and then she'd glance at the door, eyes darting like she expected it to burst open. Night fell early, wind picked up again. Then came the sound. A whistle. High, sharp, low on the trail. Not a bird. Not the wind. A man. Jacob stood slowly, rifle in hand, and moved to the window. Nothing moved outside. Then another whistle, same pattern. Macy flinched. "That's him," she said, voice no louder than breath. "That's what he used to call the dogs." Jacob's jaw clenched. He doused the lanterns, pulled the girl and her baby into the back room and placed the rifle beside her. "You hear anything, you keep quiet. You don't open that door unless it's me." Macy nodded, holding Jonah tight against her chest. Jacob returned to the front room, shotgun resting across his knees. The fire burned low. The minutes dragged. Wind howled louder now, clawing at the shutters. Then 3 knocks. Not soft. Not weak. 3 hard, deliberate bangs. Jacob didn't move. Then a voice came through the door. "Even in, friend." The voice was smooth, too smooth, familiar. "You've got something belongs to me." Jacob stood, every muscle locked. "Ain't nothing here belongs to you." A pause. "You sure about that?" the voice asked. "Little girl, little bundle of joy, you think I just let that walk off?" Jacob didn't reply. "You're a fool, mister. I've got papers, I've got law, she's mine." "She's no one's." Laughter followed, cold and grating. "That what she told you, that I beat her, that I'm some kind of monster?" Jacob didn't answer. The voice got lower. "She's a liar, a thief, ran off with my boy and half my coin." "You touch that door," Jacob said slowly, "and you'll lose the hand that did it." Silence. Then footsteps, crunching retreat but not far. Jacob waited. An hour passed, too. Then the firelight flickered. A shadow moved past the window. A moment later, glass shattered. A rock through the back window. Jacob spun and rushed into the rear room just as Macy screamed. Otis Yarrow stood in the broken window frame, arm reaching through, fingers clawing for the latch. Jacob didn't think. He raised the shotgun and fired. The blast roared through the cabin, smoke and splinters exploding from the wall. Yarrow screamed. Footsteps retreated fast, stumbling into the night. Macy was curled in the corner, Jonah screaming in her arms. Jacob dropped the gun and crossed the room in 2 strides, pulling her close, checking for blood. She was fine, shaken but fine. Jonah's cries were sharp and strong, healthy lungs, alive and terrified. Jacob held them both until the shaking slowed. Outside, the night swallowed everything again. They didn't sleep. The next morning, blood marked the snow near the tree line, dark, fresh, trailing off into the woods. Jacob followed it to the ridge and stopped. Bootprints wandered off course, staggering through drifts, disappearing into the dense pines. No body, no sign of camp, but he'd been hit, bad. He wouldn't get far. Still, Jacob didn't relax. He doubled the locks, refused to let Macy outside without him, kept the fire high and the rifle loaded. A day passed, then another. No sign of Yarrow. But that didn't mean he was gone. Macy changed in those days. She didn't ask to leave anymore, didn't talk about what came next. She just held Jonah longer, sat near Jacob more often, watched the window like it might blink. Then one morning she said it. "I want to stay." Jacob looked up from the woodpile. "You sure?" She nodded. "You're the only person that ever meant it when you said I was safe." Jacob didn't answer, not with words. He simply laid another log on the fire and pulled a second chair close. That night the ridge was quiet again, for the first time in a long time. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, uneven, hesitant but unmistakably human. Jacob Thorne rose early, stoked the fire and split wood in the gray light of dawn. Macy warmed milk on the stove and sang to Jonah, her voice stronger now, no longer a whisper tucked behind fear. The baby had begun to smile in his sleep. He still cried often, especially when the wind moaned through the trees, but his color had returned, and his limbs no longer curled from cold. There was life in the cabin again. Fragile, new, but real. And yet, no matter how calm the days seemed, neither of them forgot the blood on the snow. Jacob never said it aloud, but he checked the ridge trail every morning. The prints had long since vanished, covered by new flurries and melted under thawing ice. He found no more signs of Otis Yarrow, no broken branches, no trampled brush, no spent fires. It was as if the man had been swallowed whole by the forest. But Jacob had lived long enough to know that evil didn't just disappear. It waited. It regrouped. Sometimes it healed in the dark like a wounded dog, only to return with sharper teeth. Macy never asked if he was gone for good. She didn't want to know. Her trust in Jacob had grown, but the fear behind her eyes hadn't left. She kept her brother within arm's reach. She flinched at creaking boards. She never opened the door without checking the window first, and Jacob let her do all of it. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. One morning she stood by the window watching snow melt off the porch roof in slow, steady drips. Jonah was in her arms, swaddled and dozing. "You think he's dead?" she asked suddenly. Jacob looked up from the table where he'd been repairing a broken chair leg. He considered lying. He knew what she wanted to hear, but lying to children never did them favors. It taught them to ignore their instincts. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but if he ain't, we'll be ready." Macy nodded, eyes still fixed on the trail below. Then she asked something stranger. "What if he ain't the worst part?" Jacob paused. "What do you mean?" Macy's lips pressed together, and she looked down at Jonah. "What if the world's just full of men like him? What if I only found the edge of it?" Jacob set his tools down, crossed the room, and knelt beside her. He didn't touch her, just stayed close enough for her to feel his presence. "There are bad men," he said quietly. "Plenty of 'em, but not everyone's like him." Macy looked up. "You were." Jacob gave a tired smile. "Took me a long time to learn how not to be angry at the world. Lost people I couldn't get back. Thought I deserved the pain. Let it live in me too long." Macy's eyes searched his. "Did you ever hurt someone you loved?" The question hit harder than he expected. He thought of Miriam, of her quiet sorrow after they lost their second child, of how she'd stare at the cradle some nights as if waiting for it to rock on its own. He remembered the silence between them, the bitter edge to every word that passed after. He hadn't raised a hand, but he'd hurt her just the same, through absence, through pride, through shutting himself off. "Yes," he said finally, "but I learned from it, or tried to." Macy didn't answer, but something shifted in her posture, a small easing. She leaned against the window frame and rocked Jonah gently. That evening Jacob brought down an old wooden box from the attic. Inside were carved figures, animals mostly. A bear, a deer, a squirrel, dusty but smooth. He laid them out on the table. "Miriam made these," he said. "Said someday they'd be for little hands." Macy looked at them with wonder. She picked up the bear and turned it in her fingers. "She made all of 'em." Jacob nodded. "She was good with her hands, better than me." "Is that why you stayed out here?" Jacob didn't answer right away. "In part," he said. "After she passed, I couldn't find much reason to be anywhere else." Macy studied him. "You think she'd be mad you gave these to us?" Jacob looked at her then, really looked. This girl who had come to his door broken and shivering, carrying a baby and the weight of every bad thing a child should never know. This girl who now stood in his home, firelight flickering across her face, her arms wrapped around her brother like a mother would. "No," he said softly. "I think she'd be glad they're finally being held." The next week brought warmer days. Snow melted into thick, sucking mud. The stream at the base of the ridge swelled and broke its banks. Birds returned to the branches. Life crept back into the land, quiet but certain. Macy started reading again. Jacob had a shelf full of books, half of them theology, the other half dusty journals and frontier stories. She liked the ones with pictures best. Sometimes she'd read aloud to Jonah, who would watch her lips move, fascinated. Jacob watched her too, though he didn't let her catch him doing it. Then one afternoon, a sound echoed across the valley, faint, metallic, and unmistakable. Gunfire. Macy froze. Jacob was already at the window, rifle in hand. He scanned the ridgeline. Nothing but trees and mist, but he knew what he'd heard. One shot. Then silence. He moved fast, saddled Hooper, and told Macy to bar the door. He'd be back by sundown. She didn't cry or plead. She just nodded and hugged Jonah tighter. Jacob rode fast, following the sound. It took 2 hours to find it. A clearing, blood in the dirt. A man slumped against a boulder, his side torn open by lead. Another man dead at his feet, a pistol still clutched in his hand. Jacob approached slow, rifle ready. The wounded man looked up. His eyes were dark and clouded, his breath rattling. "You Thorne," he rasped. Jacob nodded. "What happened here?" The man spat blood. "Name's Greaves, trapper. He found me on the trail, said he was looking for a girl and a baby, showed me a drawing." Jacob's gut turned cold. Greaves coughed. I told him I seen no one. He didn't believe me, drew on me, I shot first. Jacob knelt beside him. You gonna make it? Greaves laughed once, dry and weak. Don't reckon so, bullets deep. Jacob said nothing, just pulled a flask from his coat and handed it over. Greaves drank, then handed it back. You got M, don't you? Jacob didn't deny it. Greaves smiled faintly. Good, man like that don't deserve what he's chasing. He died not long after. Jacob buried both men, marked the graves with stones, and returned home in silence. That night he told Macy what happened. He's still out there, he said, but he's hurt, desperate now. Macy didn't cry, she just stared into the fire. What if he doesn't stop? Jacob met her gaze. Then I don't stop either. A few nights later, it happened again. Jacob woke to the soft creak of a board. He rose quietly, shotgun in hand. Macy was already awake, standing in the hall with Jonah in her arms. Her eyes met his. They both knew. He signaled for her to go to the cellar. She slipped away, silent. Jacob stepped onto the porch. And there, just beyond the tree line, a shadow moved. He raised the shotgun and fired once, high, a warning. The figure stopped. A voice slithered through the dark. You ain't a good shot, Thorne. I didn't miss, Jacob replied. Next time I won't aim above. Otis laughed. It was hollow, broken. You think she's better off with you. Some half-dead rancher in a shack on a mountain. She's a liar, Jacob. She don't know what she is. Jacob didn't answer. You don't think she lied to you? Otis called. She stole from me. She let the boy cry so I'd come home. She knew what she was doing. Jacob stepped off the porch, shotgun at his hip. You want to come find out? He asked. Come on, but you best be ready to die out here. There was a long silence. Then Otis whispered, You don't know what she's done. Jacob didn't flinch. I don't care. What I know is she's got more courage in her pinky than you've got in your whole body. Then the woods fell still. Otis was gone again. Jacob stood there a long while, watching the trees. The fire inside burned bright, and through the window he saw Macy rocking Jonah, tears running silently down her cheeks. He knew the final storm hadn't come yet. But when it did, he'd be ready. They both would. By the end of that week, it was clear Otis Yarrow hadn't fled. He was circling, waiting for the right moment, wearing down their sense of peace like a wolf just outside the light of the fire. He wanted fear to do his work for him. He wanted the cabin to turn quiet with dread. But he didn't know Macy anymore, and he had never known Jacob. Jacob kept his rifle within reach at all times now. He'd take slow walks around the ridge every dawn and dusk, checking for tracks, signs of tampering, fresh markings on the trees. Otis was clever. He covered his tracks well, but not well enough. Jacob found one cigarette butt behind the smokehouse, fresh. Footprints near the well, shallow and spaced wide like someone pacing. Macy was quiet through it all, but not broken. She didn't ask if he was still out there. She already knew. Her shoulders never fully relaxed. Her eyes always flicked toward the tree line when she stepped outside, and she never let Jonah sleep without her arm across him. She had lived with Otis long enough to know the shape of his malice. He wasn't a man who charged the front door with fists swinging. He waited until your back was turned and the kettle was boiling. That was when he struck. But survival was a skill Macy had learned early. She sharpened it now like a knife. One afternoon, while Jacob patched the back fence, Macy asked if he'd teach her how to shoot. He hesitated. She didn't beg. She didn't plead. She just looked him dead in the eye and said, I'd rather be scared and ready than scared and helpless. Jacob handed her the .22 rifle and walked her through every step, how to shoulder it, how to breathe, how to line the sights with something small and still. Her first shot missed by a foot, but she didn't flinch. The second shot clipped the tin can. The third hit it clean. Good, Jacob said, nodding. Again, she replied, resetting the can. That night, as they sat by the fire, she told him what it had been like before. She didn't want pity. She wasn't unburdening herself for tears. She simply needed the truth out of her chest, where it had burned like coal for too long. He used to put Jonah in the shed when he drank, she said quietly. Said babies don't belong in the house with grown men. I'd sit by the door all night so he wouldn't cry alone. Jacob didn't speak. Macy went on. Sometimes when I did something wrong, like burned the bread or dropped a plate, he'd lock me out. Said I could sleep with the pigs if I wanted to act like one. Jacob gripped the armrest of his chair until the wood creaked. Macy looked at him. But the worst part wasn't that, it was when he was good. Jacob frowned. Good. She nodded. He'd be kind for a day, maybe two. Let me read, say I was clever, smile when Jonah giggled. I used to think maybe he wasn't all bad. Maybe I'd done something to deserve the bad parts. Maybe if I just tried harder. Jacob set his coffee down. It wasn't you, Macy. She met his gaze. I know that now, but back then I thought loving him enough might fix something. Jacob leaned forward, elbows on knees. Some men break what they touch just to prove it bleeds. That don't make it your fault. Macy nodded slowly. Then she added, I don't want Jonah to remember any of it. I want him to grow up thinking this ridge is the whole world. Jacob looked over at the cradle, where the baby slept peacefully, lips parted in a tiny breath. He might, Jacob said, if we can keep it that way. Macy fell asleep on the rug by the hearth, one hand resting on the cradle. Jacob didn't sleep. He sat by the window all night watching the woods. Somewhere out there, Otis was watching back. At dawn, Jacob saddled Hooper again. He rode to town with one thing in mind, protection. Sheriff Darrow greeted him with a squint and a steaming mug. Back already. Jacob stepped inside. I need your help. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. That a first. I'm not here for jokes, Clay. Sheriff Darrow sobered. Go on. Jacob explained everything. The stalking, the shattered window, the clearing with Greaves, the second encounter in the dark, Macy's nightmares, Jonah's cries, the sense that Otis was waiting to end this on his own terms. Darrow sat silent through it all. When Jacob finished, the sheriff set his mug down hard enough to spill some over the rim. I can put a notice out, he said. Declare Yarrow wanted for attempted harm-breaking entry. Might not stick, but it's something. I don't need a paper, Jacob said. I need a plan. Darrow eyed him. What are you thinking? Trap, Jacob said simply. Darrow sat back. Bait. Jacob nodded. You're using the girl. No, Jacob snapped. Me, I'll make it look like I left. Let him come in thinking the place is unguarded. He won't resist. Sheriff Darrow rubbed his temples. You do realize how dangerous that is. I do. You're not young anymore, Jacob. I know that too. Darrow sighed. You think the girl's worth it? Jacob stared at him. She's a child. She never had a chance. And that baby, he don't even know the world yet. You tell me if they're worth it. The sheriff didn't argue. They spent the next hour working out the plan. Darrow would send 2 deputies to wait a mile down the ridge, hidden in the trees. Jacob would ride out at sunrise and circle back through the ravine, staying out of sight. They'd leave the front door of the cabin unlatched, make it look like Macy was alone. Otis would come, and Jacob would be waiting. When Jacob returned home, he found Macy sitting on the porch, rocking Jonah softly. He explained the plan. Her face turned pale, but she nodded. I can do it. You won't be alone, he said. I'll be in the crawlspace under the floor. If he so much as breathes wrong, I'll know. Macy swallowed. He'll try to sweet talk, he always does. Pretends to be sorry, pretends he's sick, says we're family. Jacob knelt before her. You don't have to speak to him, just keep Jonah close. He lays a hand on that latch, I'll end it. Macy closed her eyes, took a breath, and nodded. We end this. That night they prayed. Jacob hadn't prayed aloud in years, but he knelt beside Macy as she rocked Jonah and asked for protection, for courage, for something stronger than hate to live in their hearts when the time came. Jacob said, Amen, with his voice trembling. Then he kissed Jonah on the forehead. Whatever happens, he whispered, you ain't going back. The trap was set. Jacob rode out before dawn, circling wide through the ravine, then crawling under the cabin floor through the hatch he'd kept sealed since Miriam died. It was cramped, cold, dusty, but from the slats in the floorboards he had a perfect view of the front door, of the table, of the hearth, of Macy standing with her baby in her arms. She paced, she sang, she cried softly when she thought no one heard. Then hours later, it happened. The door creaked open. Otis Yarrow stepped into the cabin like he owned it, face gaunt, beard patchy, arms still bandaged from the shotgun blast, but his eyes gleamed. He smiled like the devil himself. "Well now," he said, spreading his arms, "ain't this a picture?" Macy didn't move. Otis took a step closer. "Been worried sick, I have. Town says you ran off, left me to starve, but I knew better. I knew you were just scared." Macy's voice was steady. "I'm not scared anymore." Otis blinked. That threw him. "I raised you," he snapped. "I fed you, I gave you a roof. You used me." Otis growled. "I gave you everything." "You broke everything," she said. "And now I know what love feels like, and it's not you." Otis's smile disappeared. He lunged. Jacob sprang from beneath the floorboards like a thunderclap. The trapdoor crashed open. The shotgun rose before Otis reached her. Macy screamed. Jonah cried. Otis froze. "Step back," Jacob growled. Otis's hands trembled. "You wouldn't." "I would," Jacob said, "but I won't have to." The door burst open behind Otis. Sheriff Darrow stepped in, flanked by 2 deputies, rifles raised. "Otis Yarrow," Darrow said calmly, "you're under arrest." Otis didn't fight. He fell to his knees, shaking, muttering about betrayal, about lies, about fire and blood. Macy held Jonah so tight the boy whimpered against her shoulder. But she didn't let go. Jacob lowered the shotgun and stepped between her and the man who had stolen so much. She wasn't alone anymore. And Otis Yarrow was done. The law took Otis Yarrow away in irons before the snow had time to settle again. Sheriff Darrow rode ahead with him, silent as stone, while the 2 deputies flanked either side like wardens walking beside something unclean. Otis didn't scream. He didn't threaten. Not anymore. Whatever fire had lived in him had been soaked through by the sudden weight of failure. He never once looked back at the cabin, not at Macy, not at Jonah, not at Jacob. That told Jacob everything he needed to know. Otis wasn't ashamed. He wasn't heartbroken. He was just beaten, a dog with no more teeth. Macy stood on the porch with her arms around Jonah as the riders disappeared into the pines. She didn't speak, not even when they were gone. She simply stared down the ridge, her grip around the baby so firm it left red lines in her arms. Jacob stepped out beside her, quiet. "You did good," he said gently. Macy shook her head. "It ain't over." He didn't argue. It was, not really. Otis might be locked away for now, but the scars he'd carved wouldn't heal in a day. Pain like that didn't leave when the man did. It lingered, in memories, in sudden silence, in how you flinched when someone raised their voice or when a door slammed harder than it should have. But the cabin was different now. It wasn't just a place of safety anymore. It was becoming a place of becoming. They spent the next few days in recovery, not from wounds to the body but to something deeper. Macy didn't talk much. She ate little, but she rested more. She didn't sleep with one eye open anymore. She let Jonah nap in the cradle without checking the latch on the window. She sat near the fire and sometimes, if only for a second, she smiled. Jacob didn't push her. He simply carried on, chopping wood, reading aloud from the Bible in the evenings, letting silence sit between them without trying to fill it. He'd seen grief before, grief that didn't come from loss but from finally being free of something that should have never held you in the first place. Macy was learning how to breathe in that freedom, how to walk without tiptoeing, how to live without asking permission. One morning, about a week after Otis was taken, she asked Jacob a question over breakfast. "Do you think people like him get changed, like truly changed?" Jacob stirred his porridge slowly. "I think some do, but most don't want to. They see changing as losing." Losing what? Their power, their grip. They'd rather keep breaking others than fix themselves. Macy looked down. "Then I don't want to be anything like him." "You're not," Jacob said without hesitation. She looked at him, doubtful. "I see it," he added. "You fight for the right things. You carry pain, but you don't throw it. You protect. That's what makes the difference." Macy nodded, and for the first time since Otis was taken, her eyes shone, not with fear but with something like hope. That day the thaw began in earnest. Water ran down the ridge in muddy streams. The river swelled. Birds returned in greater numbers, and the earth softened enough for plowing. It was too early for planting, but Jacob let Macy help turn the soil in the small patch of garden behind the cabin. She worked quietly, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair tied back with one of Miriam's old ribbons. Jonah sat on a blanket nearby, kicking his legs and making gurgling sounds at the sky. "I think he's teething," Macy said, watching him chew on his fist. "Already," Jacob said with a half-smile. "He's early for everything. Started crying the moment he came into the world." Jacob leaned on his shovel. "Sometimes crying is how the brave say they're here." Macy looked at him and smiled faintly. They didn't talk about Otis much after that. But one afternoon, as they sat on the porch and watched a hawk circle over the trees, she asked the question Jacob had been expecting. "What's gonna happen to him?" Jacob took a long breath. "Depends. If Darrow's report holds, he'll stand trial down in Roanoke. Might get time in the county lockup. Might get sent east if they think he's dangerous enough." Macy nodded. "And if he doesn't stay locked up?" Jacob turned to her, his face solemn. "Then he'll have to go through me again." She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "He won't get through you." Later that evening, after supper and after Jonah had been tucked in, Macy pulled something from her satchel. It was a crumpled letter, creased so many times the ink had nearly faded. She handed it to Jacob. "It's from my father," she said. "Wrote it before he passed." Jacob opened it carefully. The handwriting was jagged, uneven. A man in pain trying to get words out before they left him. "To my Macy, you are the strongest soul I've ever known. You've got your mother's eyes and my stubborn heart. If I'm not there to see you grow, promise me one thing: you won't let the world turn you hard. Not even when it's cruel. Keep your softness, it's your strength." Jacob folded the letter slowly and handed it back. "He saw who you'd become." Macy pressed it to her chest. "I wish he could see me now." "He does," Jacob said. Spring edged closer. The nights grew shorter, the days longer and warmer. And slowly life settled. Jonah rolled over for the first time. Macy let out a squeal of delight and kissed his cheek a dozen times. Jacob laughed, a deep, rough sound that hadn't left his chest in years. They fixed up the barn together, patched the leaky roof, and built new pens for the goats. Macy learned how to milk and shear. She read every book in the house twice. She even started writing, small entries in a battered journal she kept hidden under her pillow. She told Jacob she was writing stories for Jonah. "One day he'll ask how we got here," she said. "I want him to know the truth, but I want him to know the beauty too." Jacob nodded. "Tell him everything, but make sure he knows who the heroes were." Macy blushed. But she kept writing. Then one afternoon, as they walked the edge of the creek, Jonah asleep against Macy's shoulder, Jacob stopped short. A man was standing across the bank, not Otis, younger, thin, nervous. He tipped his hat. "Even in." Jacob placed himself in front of Macy. "Something I can help you with." The man shifted. "Name's Callum, I work for the Roanoke court. Sheriff sent me, got news." Macy's grip on Jonah tightened. "Otis Yarrow," Callum said, voice uneasy, "escaped during transfer. Wagon was ambushed. He and another man made off into the woods. They've been spotted near the eastern pass." Jacob's blood turned to ice. Macy didn't cry, she didn't scream. She just whispered, "I knew it." Callum scratched his neck. "Sheriff says stay alert. We'll have riders posted near the ridge, but thought you should know." Jacob nodded once. "You did right." The man tipped his hat again and vanished into the trees. The silence that followed was thick. Macy sat on a fallen log, clutching Jonah so tight he let out a soft protest. Jacob stood above them, eyes scanning the woods. He knew what came next. The fight hadn't ended. It had only paused. Otis was coming, and this time he wouldn't knock. He'd come like a shadow, like rot in the floorboards, like a snake that had learned where the warmth lived. And Jacob Thorne would be ready. Macy stood slowly, her eyes fierce. "Do we run?" Jacob shook his head. "We dig in." She met his gaze. "Then we finish it." Together they walked back to the cabin, mother, child, and the man who had become something between a father and a shield. The sun dipped low, and the cabin doors were bolted. The air felt different now, not just colder but charged, as if the land itself knew what approached. The thaw had stopped. Streams that once flowed freely now lay still, frozen again by something deeper than weather. Even the birds had gone quiet. There was no mistaking it. Otis Yarrow was alive. And this time, he wasn't coming alone. Jacob Thorne had lived through enough winters to know when the wind shifted for war. He could feel it in the way the wolves howled longer at night, in how the horses turned skittish, ears twitching at nothing. The very soil seemed to brace itself. For 3 days after the warning came, Jacob prepared. He sharpened every blade in the house, checked and rechecked the rifles, and laid traps along the tree line. Simple snares mostly, but enough to slow a man who wasn't careful. He strung bells across the eastern pass, concealed by branches and brush, their wires so fine even a hunter might miss them. He moved with purpose but not panic. Fear was useful, but only if you controlled it. That's what he'd learned in his years in the war, and what Miriam had reminded him of each time life got heavy. Move slow, think smart, strike when it counts. Macy watched everything he did. And when he was done, she stepped forward and said, "Teach me too." He didn't argue. She learned fast, again, how to reload the shotgun without fumbling, how to kneel low and still behind the brush, how to tell a snapping branch from a deer or a man. At night they took shifts, one always awake, one by the fire, the door never unlocked, the windows never dark. Macy didn't ask if it was worth it. She already knew it was. Jonah began to sense the tension. He cried more often now, not with pain but with something deeper, an unsettledness. He clung to Macy's dress at all times and whimpered in his sleep. Jacob saw the worry behind Macy's eyes, but she never let it spill over. She was learning to be a mother in a world that hadn't given her the choice. On the 4th night, the bells rang. Soft. Far. East Ridge. Jacob was on his feet in seconds. Macy clutched Jonah and ducked behind the cellar door as they'd planned. Jacob pressed himself against the front wall, eyes on the window. Silence. Then a flicker, a figure moving through the trees, slow and deliberate. Otis maybe, but not alone. Another shape followed behind. 2 men. Jacob tightened his grip on the rifle. They moved with care. These weren't drunk outlaws stumbling through brush. These were men with intent, patience, discipline. Otis had brought help. The bells stopped ringing. And then nothing. Jacob waited. Then came the voice. Not from outside, but from behind. He spun, heart pounding. Macy. Screaming. He burst through the cellar door to find her standing at the far end, shotgun raised, eyes wide with fury and terror. A man lay at her feet, motionless, a knife still clutched in his hand. Jonah cried from his cradle in the corner. Jacob crossed the space in seconds, checked the man. Dead. Neck bent clean, likely from the fall down the stairs. Macy shook, the shotgun still trembling in her hands. He came through the back, she whispered. The trapdoor, he found it. Jacob took the weapon gently from her hands. You did right. I didn't even think, she said, breath ragged. He was there, just there. Jonah's cries rose louder. Jacob lifted him, rocking gently until the sobs softened. When they emerged, the night was still. But Jacob knew it wasn't over. They'd sent one man to draw their eyes. The other had tried to strike while they were distracted. It was smart, too smart for Otis. Which meant the man outside wasn't just a stray gun for hire. He was something else, possibly someone worse. Jacob didn't sleep. And when morning broke pale and brittle, he found new prints circling the cabin. One set, larger, heavier, had come close, just beneath the bedroom window. They had stopped there for a time, long enough to leave a compressed impression. Watching. And then they turned back. Macy joined him outside, wrapped in her shawl, Jonah bundled in her arms. She stared at the tracks without speaking. Jacob finally said, He's waiting for us to panic. Macy nodded, Let's not. They buried the body deep, far from the cabin, and burned his coat and boots to leave no scent. Jacob didn't know the man's name. Didn't need to. His role had been clear: bait, breach, kill if possible. The kind of man who took coin to hurt strangers. No questions asked. Macy stood beside the grave, quiet. Then she said, "Otis never had friends, not real ones. He must have paid them." Jacob looked toward the woods. That, or someone hates me enough to help him. Macy looked up, startled. "You?" she asked. Jacob didn't answer. She didn't press. But she remembered what the sheriff had said about Jacob before the ridge, about loss, about silence that followed a man like a second shadow. He never talked about it. And maybe now wasn't the time. That evening, Jacob found an envelope nailed to the chicken coop. It hadn't been there that morning. Inside, a single sheet of paper hastily scrawled. "You still got what's mine. You think you saved her, but she was never yours to keep. Will come when you least expect. This time we don't knock." Macy read it once, then she folded it and threw it in the fire. "Let him come," she said. But Jacob didn't smile. He knew what a man did when his threats stopped working. He turned to desperation. And desperate men were the most dangerous kind. That night they laid new traps, reinforced the cellar door with nails and iron braces. They moved Jonah's cradle to the far wall, behind the bed and beneath the window. Jacob taught Macy how to aim through the narrow slit in the wall he'd carved years ago as an escape route. "We don't shoot unless we mean to kill," he told her. "No warning shots this time." She nodded, her hands were steady. "I'm not afraid of him anymore," she said. Jacob believed her. But he was afraid. Not for himself. For her. For the boy. For what it would do to her if she had to take a life again. The following morning, snow fell again. Not heavy, but enough to paint the trail white and leave fresh prints. And those prints came. 2 sets. From the east. They circled, they waited. Jacob tracked them for hours, but never found the men. Then a knock. But not on the door. On the wall. 3 slow taps against the outer logs. Jacob's blood ran cold. He crept to the side window and peeked through the slit. No one. He opened the trapdoor to the crawl space and listened. Nothing. He emerged, heart pounding. Then came a voice. From above. On the roof. I remember when she used to sing. Jacob fired through the ceiling. A thud. A scramble. A shout. He rushed outside just in time to see a man, face covered in a scarf, rolling off the far side of the roof and vanishing into the trees. Blood marked the snow where his leg had landed wrong. A second figure darted after him. Jacob didn't give chase. He knew better. Back inside, Macy clutched Jonah, shaking. Was it him? She asked. Jacob nodded. He's getting bolder. Macy looked at the cradle. Then we make the last move. Jacob frowned. What were you saying? She looked him dead in the eye. We go to him. Jacob stared at her, heart sinking. That's not how this works. It has to, she said. He'll never stop. He's not going to wait forever. We know where he camps. We saw the smoke near the ridge. You said it yourself. He's watching. Jacob shook his head. You're not a soldier. I'm not a victim either. He didn't answer. But he saw it in her eyes. She meant it. This wasn't a child anymore. This was a girl grown hard in the fire, forged by survival, tempered by love for a baby who didn't know what world he'd been born into. She wouldn't wait for fear to knock again. And Jacob knew, deep in his bones, that one way or another, the final reckoning had come. Macy didn't speak. You don't have the guts, Otis spat. You think you're strong now. You ain't. You're just a scared little mouse hiding behind a broken old man. Macy's hand trembled, but only for a second. Then she said, I'm not killing you. Otis's grin returned. But I am done running from you. She stepped closer, dropped the revolver to the ground and said, You're nothing. That hit him harder than any bullet could have. Jacob stepped forward and cold-cocked him across the jaw. Otis collapsed. They bound his hands and feet with the rope Jacob had packed and hauled him to town the next morning. Sheriff Darrow took one look at the battered man, then at Macy, and nodded. "This time he won't get out," he said. "We'll ride him all the way to Fort Pelham. No stops, no distractions." Otis didn't speak. His eyes were empty now, defeated, unmade. Macy stood tall beside Jacob, Jonah in her arms. As the wagon rode away, she didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply said, "Let's go home." The cabin was different when they returned. Not in structure. In spirit. It wasn't just a place of safety anymore. It was a place of belonging. The silence wasn't heavy now, it was peaceful. The hearth crackled warmly. The garden had begun to sprout. Birds sang in the trees again. Macy moved through the rooms with a steadiness that hadn't been there before. She laughed louder, sang more, wrote daily in her journal, and began teaching Jonah words by tracing letters in the dust on the windowsill. Jacob sat with his Bible again, not as a man waiting to die, but as someone grateful to still be here. And one evening, as the sun dipped low and the fields glowed gold, Macy turned to him and asked, "Would it be all right if I called you Pa?" Jacob didn't answer at first. He swallowed hard. Then he nodded. "I'd be honored." Jonah gurgled beside her. And for the first time in a long time, Jacob Thorne let himself smile with nothing held back. Because sometimes family didn't come by blood. Sometimes it came by fire. By storms weathered. By pain endured. And when it did, it didn't just heal what was broken, it built something new. Something unshakable. And on that ridge, in a cabin that had once been nothing more than shelter from the wind, something beautiful took root. Not just survival. Not just protection. But love. Home.